The Senate floor debate on congressional oversight authority and the proper scope of legislative investigations had drawn national attention as potentially establishing precedent regarding how aggressive legislative branch could be in examining executive branch conduct without violating separation of powers, principles that protected each branch's constitutional independence. With the debate featuring what C-SPAN commentators characterized as rare opportunity for extended substantive discussion of constitutional questions, given that Senate leadership had agreed to special debate format allowing extended remarks and direct exchanges between members rather than typical brief statements that characterized most Senate floor activity. Mitch McConnell stood at his Senate desk as minority leader whose decades of legislative experience, whose reputation as master tactician, whose understanding of Senate procedure and constitutional structure exceeded perhaps any other member's expertise, and whose acerbic wit and willingness to deploy cutting mockery against opponents whose positions he viewed as constitutionally or politically naive had made him formidable debater whose interventions in floor debates could devastate unprepared House members or junior senators who hadn't anticipated his capacity to exploit procedural knowledge and rhetorical skill to embarrass those he targeted. Jasmine Crockett had been invited to address the Senate as House member, participating in special joint debate format. Her inclusion reflecting bipartisan recognition that her constitutional expertise and her demonstrated ability to engage substantively with complex oversight questions warranted hearing House perspective directly, rather than relying on senators to characterize House positions. Despite concerns from some senators that allowing House member to participate in Senate floor debate might create precedent they would later regret if future participants lacked Crockett's sophistication. The debate had been proceeding through various senators' remarks about congressional authority when Mitch McConnell had begun what experienced Senate observers recognized as one of his signature build-ups to cutting mockery, a series of seemingly technical procedural observations that were clearly designed to culminate in devastating put-down of House member whose presence in Senate chamber McConnell had made clear through various subtle signals he viewed as inappropriate regardless of her constitutional expertise. Then Mitch McConnell had delivered what was clearly his prepared mockery statement, dripping with condescension, suggesting that, while he appreciated House members' enthusiasm for constitutional discussion, perhaps she should recognize that Senate's constitutional role as world's greatest deliberative body, with special responsibility for advising and consenting to treaties and appointments, gave senators particular expertise in separation of powers, questions that House members, regardless of their legal training or rhetorical skills, simply couldn't match, given institutional differences between chambers that the framers had deliberately designed to make Senate the more deliberative and constitutionally sophisticated body. His mockery delivered with theatrical timing and with evident expectation that House member would either remain silent in face of Senate minority leader's institutional authority or would offer defensive response that his procedural mastery would enable him to further embarrass through additional cutting remarks. What Mitch McConnell had catastrophically miscalculated was that Crockett would respond not with defensive assertion about House prerogatives or with general constitutional principles, but rather with instant comeback so precise in exposing the fundamental irony of someone who had spent years blocking Senate's constitutional responsibilities, refusing to hold hearings on Supreme Court nominee Merrick Garland, refusing to consider hundreds of House-passed bills, refusing to fulfill Senate's constitutional duties when those duties conflicted with partisan interests, now invoking Senate's constitutional sophistication to mock her advocacy for aggressive oversight that Senate's own constitutional responsibilities required, supporting rather than obstructing, delivered with such perfect timing and with such devastating precision in connecting his mockery directly to his own documented failures to fulfill the very constitutional responsibilities he was invoking to claim Senate superiority, that her comeback would stun not just McConnell but the entire Senate chamber, by proving that his attempt to mock House member through institutional superiority claims had walked directly into exposure that his own record contradicted the constitutional sophistication he was claiming for Senate that his leadership had actually undermined. If you want to see what happens when Senate Minority Leader mocks House member by invoking Senate's constitutional sophistication, and that member responds with instant comeback, exposing that the mocker's own record includes years of blocking Senate's constitutional responsibilities in ways that contradict the sophistication being claimed. Stunning the entire Senate chamber by proving institutional superiority, mockery was hypocrisy from someone whose leadership had violated the very responsibilities being invoked. Subscribe to this channel immediately because we are going to examine every element of how Crockett's instant comeback stunned the Senate and why this moment became legendary for demonstrating that mockery based on institutional authority creates perfect vulnerability. When the mocker's own record includes failures to fulfill the very institutional responsibilities being invoked as basis for superiority claims, McConnell's mockery of Crockett had come during her remarks defending robust congressional oversight authority. She had been explaining constitutional foundations when McConnell had risen to deliver what was clearly his prepared put-down. McConnell had said with evident condescension, "I've been listening with interest to the remarks from our House colleague, and I want to say that while I appreciate Representative Crockett's enthusiasm for these constitutional questions, I think perhaps we should all remember the institutional differences that the framers deliberately designed between our two chambers." The Senate chamber had focused on McConnell, his tone making clear he was about to deliver cutting mockery. McConnell had continued, "The Senate, as the framers envisioned it, is the world's greatest deliberative body. We have special constitutional responsibilities advising and consenting to treaties, to judicial appointments, to executive nominations. These responsibilities require constitutional sophistication and institutional wisdom that comes from Senate's unique role. The House, with all due respect to our colleagues there, serves different function. It's more populist, more immediate, more, shall we say, enthusiastic in its approach to constitutional questions. That's not criticism, it's recognition of what the framers intended through bicameralism. He had delivered what he clearly believed was his cutting conclusion. So when Representative Crockett advocates for aggressive congressional oversight, with the enthusiasm characteristic of the House, perhaps she should defer to the Senate's constitutional sophistication on questions of how to properly balance legislative authority with respect for coordinate branches. We've been doing this longer, and we understand the nuances that her chamber, with its 2-year terms and more partisan character, sometimes misses. The mockery had been comprehensive and delivered with McConnell's signature combination of procedural authority and cutting condescension, clearly designed to embarrass House member by suggesting institutional inferiority. But what happened next would stun the entire Senate chamber. Crockett had remained standing calmly during McConnell's mockery, and the instant he finished, she delivered comeback with perfect timing and devastating precision. Crockett had responded, "Immediately, Senator McConnell. You just invoked the Senate's constitutional responsibility to advise and consent to judicial appointments as evidence of this chamber's constitutional sophistication. So let me ask you directly, where was that constitutional sophistication in 2016, when you refused to hold hearings on Merrick Garland's Supreme Court nomination for 293 days, blocking the Senate from fulfilling the very constitutional responsibility you just invoked to mock me?" The Senate chamber erupted in audible gasps. Crockett had instantly turned McConnell's institutional superiority, mockery, into exposure of his most controversial violation of Senate's constitutional responsibilities. But Crockett wasn't finished. She had continued with increasing force. "You lectured me about the Senate's special constitutional responsibilities and its institutional wisdom. But, Senator McConnell, you led this chamber in refusing to fulfill its constitutional duty to consider a Supreme Court nominee because doing so might have resulted in confirming a justice nominated by Democratic president. You blocked hundreds of bills passed by the House from even receiving votes in the Senate bills addressing health care, infrastructure, voting rights because considering them might have forced senators to take positions you viewed as politically inconvenient. You've presided over systematic obstruction of Senate's constitutional responsibilities whenever those responsibilities conflicted with your partisan interests. And now you have the audacity to invoke Senate's constitutional sophistication to mock a House member advocating for aggressive oversight." She had delivered her devastating conclusion. "Senator McConnell, the Senate's constitutional sophistication that you're so proud of has been systematically undermined by your leadership. You've turned the world's greatest deliberative body into legislative graveyard where constitutional responsibilities go to die when fulfilling them might hurt Republicans politically. So no, Senator I will not defer to Senate's supposed constitutional sophistication on oversight questions. Because your record proves that when constitutional responsibilities conflict with partisan advantage, you choose partisanship while claiming institutional superiority. That's not sophistication, that's hypocrisy. The Senate chamber sat in absolute stunned silence. Mitch McConnell's face showed complete shock, his confident mockery having been instantly transformed into spectacular self-inflicted humiliation. As Crockett connected his institutional superiority claims directly to his documented failures to fulfill the very constitutional responsibilities he had invoked. Democratic senators sat with visible expressions of satisfaction at seeing McConnell's mockery backfire so completely. Even some Republican senators appeared uncomfortable, clearly recognizing that Crockett had identified vulnerability in McConnell's position. That was impossible to defend his mockery of others about constitutional sophistication was undermined by his own record of blocking Senate's constitutional responsibilities. After long, painful silence, McConnell attempted to respond. The Senate's consideration of judicial nominees involves complex constitutional questions about timing and but multiple senators could be heard responding that attempting to justify 293-day refusal to consider Garland only reinforced Crockett's point that McConnell's constitutional sophistication claims were contradicted by his actual record. The presiding officer attempted to restore order and move debate forward, but the remainder of the session proceeded with dramatically altered dynamics. McConnell made no further interventions, apparently recognizing that his mockery had backfired spectacularly. The immediate aftermath focused entirely on how Crockett's instant comeback had stunned the Senate by turning McConnell's institutional superiority mockery into exposure of his documented failures to fulfill Senate's constitutional responsibilities. C-SPAN's footage of the exchange was viewed over 30 million times within 48 hours, becoming one of the most viral Senate floor moments in years. Political commentators across the spectrum acknowledged that Crockett's comeback had been devastatingly effective. Conservative commentator David French wrote, "Mitch McConnell walked into perfect trap by invoking Senate's constitutional sophistication." Crockett's immediate reference to Garland blockade exposed the hypocrisy of claiming institutional superiority. While having blocked Senate's constitutional duty for nearly a year, progressive commentators celebrated the exchange as long overdue, calling out of McConnell's systematic obstruction of Senate responsibilities. Multiple noted that McConnell's visible shock at Crockett's comeback suggested he hadn't anticipated that House member would so directly challenge his institutional authority by referencing his most controversial actions. Constitutional scholars confirmed that Crockett's characterization of McConnell's record was accurate. His refusal to consider Garland had indeed represented unprecedented blockade of Senate's constitutional responsibility, and his systematic obstruction of House-passed legislation had undermined Senate's deliberative function. For the Senate as institution, having its minority leader's mockery of House member backfire so completely created uncomfortable recognition that McConnell's leadership had indeed damaged Senate's reputation for constitutional sophistication that his mockery had attempted to invoke. For Mitch McConnell personally, being stunned into visible silence by instant comeback exposing his hypocrisy was rare experience for someone whose procedural mastery typically enabled dominating floor debates. His inability to defend his Garland blockade or his systematic obstruction when Crockett directly challenged them confirmed that these remained indefensible vulnerabilities, despite years of his attempting to justify them. For Crockett, stunning the Senate through instant comeback demonstrated that McConnell's institutional authority and procedural expertise could not protect him from exposure of documented hypocrisy when his mockery gave perfect opening. In subsequent interviews, Crockett explained that she had anticipated McConnell might invoke Senate's institutional superiority to mock House members' participation in debate. She had prepared by recognizing that his invocation of Senate's constitutional responsibilities would create perfect opportunity to reference his systematic failures to fulfill those responsibilities. She emphasized that the instant nature of her comeback responding immediately to connect his mockery to his Garland blockade was strategically important because it prevented him from controlling narrative and demonstrated that his institutional authority couldn't shield him from accountability for his record. She noted that McConnell's visible shock reflected his recognition that his prepared mockery had given her perfect opening to expose contradictions between his claims about Senate sophistication and his actual record of undermining Senate's constitutional functions. So, if this examination of how institutional superiority mockery can be instantly turned into stunning exposure of mockers, documented failures to fulfill the very responsibilities being invoked, has shown you that invoking institutional authority requires that one's record reflects that authority rather than contradicting it, and that instant comebacks connecting mockery to mockers' vulnerabilities can devastate through timing and precision. Subscribe to this channel for continued analysis of moments when prepared mockery becomes self-inflicted humiliation. The Senate floor debate, where Mitch McConnell mocked Jasmine Crockett and her instant comeback stunned the Senate, was more than satisfying confrontation. It was demonstration that mockery based on institutional superiority claims creates perfect vulnerability when the mocker's record includes systematic violations of the very institutional responsibilities being invoked. That instant comebacks, connecting mockery directly to documented hypocrisy, can stun entire chambers by exposing that claims to constitutional sophistication are contradicted by actual record of blocking constitutional duties when they're conflicted with partisan interests, and that sometimes the most devastating responses are immediate connections between what mockers claim as institutional authority and what their records prove about how they've actually exercised that authority in ways that undermine rather than exemplify the sophistication they invoke to mock others whose advocacy for fulfilling constitutional responsibilities reveals the hypocrisy of those who claim superior wisdom, while systematically obstructing the very responsibilities that such wisdom should have compelled them to fulfill.